The Middle East is arguably the most complex region on Earth. Currently, it is home to some of the world's wealthiest nations and its most failing states. It holds over half of the planet's known oil reserves, yet it is the site of the longest-running conflicts in modern history. To the outside observer, the headlines blur together into one giant, chaotic narrative of instability. But if you look closer, the Middle East isn't a monolith. It is a patchwork of ancient rivals, modern borders, and distinct cultures that have little in common beyond their geography. To truly understand why this region dominates the global news cycle, you can't just look at the map as a whole. You have to look at the specific history and incentives of every single player on the board. We will be starting with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is also known as the graveyard of empires. For millennia, the dreams of conquerors have shattered on the rocky cliffs of the rugged country, from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan to the Soviet Union and finally George W. Bush, all managed to occupy the nation but only temporarily, as the mountainous terrain make Afghanistan a natural fortress perfect for guerrilla warfare, so much so that any occupying empire eventually decided the pain is not worth it and left humiliated. Now Afghanistan is ruled by the Taliban, following the retreat of the US in 2021, turning the country into an Islamic emirate governed by the Sharia law. Their human rights violations, especially for women, have turned the nation into a pariah on the international scene, and only the most opportunistic countries would want to have anything to do with them. Bahrain is a small archipelago within the Persian Gulf, their geographical location making the islands a key trading hub since ancient times. Due to their small size, Bahrain knew that they could never be a dominant power in the region through sheer might alone, but they could prove to be an invaluable ally to the world powers. Despite not having much in terms of oil and gas reserves, Bahrain serves their personal refinery, importing crude oil from their neighbors and processing it for them. They are also the host of the largest US naval base in the Middle East, holding the fleets of over 34 ally countries that are guarding the Straits of Hormuz, a vital choke point in the global oil trade. The wisdom of Bahrain turned the island nation into a thriving metropolis, attracting both tourists and investors seeking a gateway into the Middle East. Cyprus. Normally, you wouldn't think of Cyprus as part of the Middle East. They even belong to the European Union. Nevertheless, their history ties them to the region. In the Bronze Age, Cyprus served as one of the main sources of copper to the ancient world, a treasured metal for its versatility to this very day. In 1974, modern Cyprus has been invaded by Turkey, the northern part of the country declaring itself independent, although the only nation that recognizes it as such is Turkey itself. Moving on to Egypt, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. In order to get a sense of just how ancient Egypt really is, when the Great Pyramids were being built, woolly mammoths were still alive in the northernmost regions of Siberia, and at that time, Egypt had already been an empire for centuries. Not only that, but the Great Pyramid of Giza was as old to the pharaoh Cleopatra as Cleopatra is old to us. Modern Egypt is the custodian of the Suez Canal, a vital choke point for the global trade that links the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, allowing Europe to trade with Asia without ships having to go around the entire African continent. Next is Iran. Iran, formerly known as Persia, is a civilization that is perhaps as old as the Egypt, the Persian Empire in one form or another being a dominant force on the world stage for a majority of human history. Iran changed its name in 1979 during the Islamic Revolution, and up until that point, it was a surprisingly free country. Now it is one of the few Shia Muslim majority states, while most of other countries in the Middle East are Sunni Muslims. Their legal code is based on the Sharia law, and they even have a morality police that has been at the center of various human rights abuse scandals. Most notably, the Masa Amini protests. Iran is one of the most sanctioned nations on the planet due to their widespread support of terrorist groups across the world and their attempts to illegally develop nuclear weapons. But the ruling elites aren't really concerned with the sanctions, as they had impacted ordinary citizens the most, with Iran seeing inflation soaring in the past 8 years from only 7% to a whopping 44%. Iraq is home to the most ancient civilizations on the country. The country is crossed by the rivers Tigris and Euphrates that have created alongside them some of the most fertile farmlands on this planet, allowing early humans to settle there and lay the foundations of civilization with empires like Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. During the Middle Ages, Iraq and its capital Baghdad became the shining jewel of the Islamic Caliphate, an empire rivaling Rome in its size and longevity. During their reign, the Middle East became a beacon for the arts and sciences, only ending ending during the Mongol invasion in the 13th century with Baghdad being burnt to the ground. Fast forward to modern times, during the First Gulf War, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein thought to invade weakened Iran that just went through their revolution. Unfortunately for Saddam, his plan didn't work, and his offensive stalled after only 3 months, followed by a counter-invasion staged by Iran that ultimately ended the war in a stalemate. Angry that he was defeated, Saddam Hussein then decided to invade Kuwait in 1990, and this time he actually succeeded in occupying the country, only to be kicked out by a US-led coalition, but only after setting fire to the Kuwaiti oil fields in a folly attempt to stop their advance. And finally, in 2003, Iraq was invaded again by the United States under the false pretenses that they were developing weapons of mass destruction, which ended with the capture and execution of Saddam Hussein in 2006. The vacuum of power left by his departure threw the country into a cycle of insurgencies that the US forces tried to quell until they finally gave up and left in 2011. Alright, Israel. Israel is the home of likely the first city ever founded in human history, Jericho, and even more importantly, it is the first place where humanity has ever made beer. Israel is the only nation that has a Jewish majority religion, Judaism being one of the oldest religions in the world, serving as a foundation for both Christianity and Islam. Despite Jewish people being present in the area for millennia, the modern state of Israel is a more recent state of affairs, being founded only after the end of the Second World War as a response to the persecution of Jews in Europe by the Axis powers. The neighboring nations were expectedly unhappy with a new country popping up in their backyard, especially one that is supported by a foreign power. A civil war erupted almost immediately after between the local Arab militias and the Israeli forces, a war that was soon joined on the Muslim side by Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Against all the odds, Israel won, but this would only cement a tradition of conflict and mistrust in the region that would continue to spark conflicts with tragic consequences. The latest one being the occupation of the Gaza Strip by Israel that resulted in the loss of tens of thousands of lives, most of them on the Palestinian side. Jordan. Jordan is named after the river that borders themselves and Israel. They also share their access to the Dead Sea, a body of water with such a high content of salt that you basically always float in because of its high density that is also said to have healing properties for bones. Jordan is also home to Petra, the capital of an ancient empire carved directly into the cliff, bringing wonder to millions of curious visitors every year. Considering their geographical location, Jordan is quite a politically stable nation. The stability is in part brought on by the fact that it is a monarchy, meaning that there aren't as many groups struggling for power, and also because Jordan managed to stay mostly neutral in the regional conflicts for the past few decades, acting as a mediator between the factions. Kuwait. Just with Bahrain, Kuwait has long been an important trading hub due to their location where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates spill into the Persian Gulf. Despite being a small nation, Kuwait also managed to maintain its independence by playing the global powers that wanted to conquer it, pitting rivals against each other such as the Ottoman Empire and the Sultanate of Nejd or Iraq and Saudi Arabia in modern times. The difference between Kuwait and Bahrain is that Kuwait is ridiculously rich in oil. Despite being such a small country, Kuwait has more oil reserves than behemoths such as Russia, China, or the United States. Lebanon is the birthplace of the Phoenician civilizations, the greatest sailors of the ancient world, Herodotus even claiming, albeit with disbelief, that they even managed to circumnavigate the continent of Africa. Phoenicians settled much of the Mediterranean coast, one of these settlements becoming the city of Carthage, the famous opponents of the rising Roman Empire and the home to the brilliant general Hannibal Barca. After gaining their independence in 1943, Lebanon became prosperous with thriving tourism and financial sectors, but the continuous conflict between Israel and Palestine at their borders spilled into their country as well, triggering a civil war that would destabilize the nation until this very day. The radical Shia organization Hezbollah holds significant sway in the politics of the country, and at the time of recording, they have recently agreed to a tentative ceasefire with Israel that, if upheld by both sides, could potentially lead to an end to the fighting for now. Libya. Prehistorical cave paintings show that Libya was once a land lush with grasslands, deltas, and rivers, but climate change throughout the millennia turned the region into desert. The first people who settled Libya were the Berbers, a nomadic culture that moved from place to place, following their grazing herds. They were also fearsome warriors, as the ancient Berbers even managed to occupy Egypt and gave them 2 dynasties of Berber pharaohs. Libya has also been a destination for Bronze Age colonizers, its northern coast being settled by the Greeks and its current capital Tripoli being settled by the Phoenicians. In modern history, Libya has been the main battleground during the North African campaign during the Second World War. The nation was invaded by the Italians, only to be kicked out by the Allied forces. After gaining their independence from the British in 1951, Libya discovered massive oil reserves that, alongside the wealth it brought, also invited the typical set of problems that come with it. In 1969, the Muammar Gaddafi came into power by overthrowing the king in a military coup. On the one hand, Gaddafi did develop the transport infrastructure of the nation and built massive irrigation projects to bring water to the coastal cities, but on the other hand, he did publicly execute an engineering student in a basketball court. He did organize a bombing of Americans in a Berlin nightclub that triggered the United States to bomb the nation. Oman. Oman lies on the eastern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Just as with Cyprus, it served as an important source of copper for the region, but not only, as they also produced a native fragrance called frankincense, one of the gifts mentioned in the Bible that were presented at the birth of Jesus Christ. Modern Oman is making great progress into becoming a modern, wealthy state with a growing standard of living and a healthy tourist industry. Palestine is not recognized as a nation by some major countries, most notably the United States, but 75% of UN member countries do recognize them, so I believe they deserve their spot on this list. The first mentions of Palestine in history are made by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, speaking of a district of Syria named Philistia in the 5th century BC. Fast forward after the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, Palestine became a territory under the influence of the British, holding the name of Mandatory Palestine with the intent of creating a Jewish national home without giving any thought to the local Arab population. Creating an artificial conflict in the region has led to the terrible century of loss and hatred between the people. Now, the region of Israel and Palestine has been for millennia a point of contention for the world powers, as the city Jerusalem is considered holy by Christianity, Islam, and the Hebrew faith. But the foreign interference that plagued the nations for the past century only pushed to create one of the most conflicted geopolitical situations ever witnessed on this planet. Qatar. Not much is known about the ancient history of Qatar. We know that the people who conquered the Empire of Babylon were called Kassites, and they originally came from Qatar. We also know that they extracted a rare and expensive purple pigment from the glands and shells of sea snails. Upon the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, Qatar was one of the first regions to embrace the new religion. Also, in 2022, they became the first country in the Middle East to host the FIFA World Cup, although the event was wrought with claims of use of forced labor for the preparation of the event. Saudi Arabia. The early human settlers of the Arabian Peninsula were called Bedouins, nomadic tribes similar to the Berbers, both in their lifestyles as well as in the trouble that they gave to the northern empires of Egypt and Assyria. In the 6th century after Christ, the Prophet Muhammad was born in the holy city of Mecca and founded the religion of Islam. He was the first to unite Arabia and spread Islam to its people, laying the foundation for the rise of the Islamic caliphates that would conquer the world as far to the east as India and as far to the west as Spain. The first foreign empire that would conquer the peninsula would be the Ottomans, but during the First World War, the Arabian population would lead a successful revolt against their overlords with the support of the French and the British. In the aftermath of the fighting, a man named Ibn Saud would lead his people and conquer the lands that are now known as Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the largest nation in the Arabian Peninsula as well as the wealthiest. They hold both Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities of Islam, the second largest religion in the world, and they welcome millions of pilgrims every year during the event known as Hajj. Despite its outrageous oil wealth and close ties with the United States, Saudi Arabia is still one of the most conservative nations in the region, being an absolute monarchy and following a strict version of Islam known as Wahhabism, only giving women the right to vote in 2015 and the right to drive in 2018. Syria. Just as Iraq, Syria is part of the region known as the Fertile Crescent, meaning that you can find there some of the oldest signs of human civilization. They were the first people to farm crops in history, the oldest alphabet, oldest piece of music, oldest library, and perhaps the first democracy in history. Unfortunately for the nation, their positioning is just as much a curse as it is a blessing. Standing at the crossroads between continents, Syria has constantly been a battlefield since early human history, up until the rise of the Ottoman Empire, when the region has finally seen 4 centuries of relative peace But after the end of the First World War, they shared the same fate as the rest of the Middle East, having their borders drawn up by colonial empires. After finally getting their independence, the country has been plagued by coup after military coup that finally culminated in a deadly civil war in 2011. The government forces ultimately came ahead with the support of Russia, but the rebel forces made a stunning push into the Damascus and drove out the dictator Assad, laying the ground for a long-awaited period of peace and prosperity for the nation. Turkey. The region that is now Turkey is one of the oldest and most stable regions of the Roman Empire, but it finally fell out of their hands within the 12th century when a group of nomads called the Seljuk Turks descended from Siberia towards Anatolia. On their way, they picked up the customs of Persians and converted to Islam and conquered much of the Middle East. The Turks conquered what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire, and in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II occupied the city of Constantinople, turning it into the capital of what will come to be known as the Ottoman Empire that would dominate the Balkans, the Middle East, and Northern Africa for centuries to come. But as time passed, the Ottoman Empire seemed to be stuck in time. Their power made them complacent and corrupt, so much so that at the end of the First World War, their empire was dismantled. Amidst the chaos, a man remembered by the name Ataturk would defend the borders of modern Turkey and reform it into a secular state by turning it into a democracy and giving women the right to vote. Now, Turkey is a member of NATO but has often acted as a mediator between the United States and Russia during the war in Ukraine. When it came to the Syrian civil war, Turkey positioned itself strategically by supporting the rebels who opposed the state, but also the Kurds, a people who have long been persecuted by the Turks that aspire for an independent state in the east of Anatolia. The United Arab Emirates. In ancient times, the region of the UAE was known for its exports of gold, pearls, wine, and slaves. They've spent most of history as being part of one empire or another, usually either Persian or Islamic caliphates, until the 15th century when the Portuguese arrived and took control over the region in order to secure their trade with the East. The Portuguese were eventually kicked out about 300 years later by the Dutch and British, and around this time, the tribes inhabiting saw their chance to profit off the trade by becoming pirates. This expectedly angered the Brits, who sent a force to crush the pirates and eventually signed a peace treaty that would end the fighting, turning the Emirates into a protectorate. In the 20th century, the Emirates went through an economic crisis as the pearls trade crashed when the Japanese discovered how to grow culture pearls. Luckily for them, they soon discovered a far more valuable resource, oil. After the British left during the 1960s, the Emir of Abu Dhabi proposed the Emirates would unify the 7 Emirates, giving birth to the UAE. The Emirates proceeded to use their massive oil wealth to build the stunning cities that we all know today. Although much of the work was done by foreign workers who vastly outnumber the local population, but are denied many rights such as forming unions or the right to strike. And finally, Yemen. Most of the Bedouin tribes in the Arabian Peninsula trace their roots back to Yemen. During ancient times, the nation was the center of Arabian civilization. Even the holy cities of Mecca and Medina have initially started out as trade stations for caravans on their way to Yemen, but their importance would fade as time passed, the biggest hit coming in the 20th century. After surveying their territory, Yemen would find little oil to extract. The split country unified in 1990, but the lack of resources and the competing factions have weakened the stability of the nation that needed only a slight push to fall into chaos. The Arab Spring of 2011 was definitely stronger than a push for Yemen, more like a train crash, and it was definitely enough to throw the country into chaos. I wish I could have ended on a more cheerful note. The Middle East is a region with a fascinating history and beautiful cultures, but their strategic location and natural oil wealth have been both a blessing and a curse. I personally have much hope for the future of the Middle East, and I believe that the conflicts that we are so familiar with will eventually find a peaceful resolution, and allow the people to focus on building better lives for themselves. I really hope that you enjoyed this video.